The wind came down off the high plains that afternoon, the way it always did in late summer, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass and something faintly sweet that nobody could ever name. And in the middle of that dust, at the very edge of where the wagon ruts turned into the main track of the settlement, stood a woman who had nowhere left to go. Her name was Maren, though there weren't many in that place who would say it aloud just yet. She had on a travel-stained dress the color of wheat coffee and a pair of boots that had walked further than most folks could imagine. And in both her hands, she clutched the worn leather strap of a satchel that held just about everything she still owned in this world. Now, you have to understand, friend, that a woman alone on the frontier was a thing the towns did not know what to do with. A widow they could pity, a wife they could welcome. But a woman who had been left, abandoned, the hard, ugly word the gossips used behind their hands. Well, that was a different matter entirely. That was a question with no good answer, and so the easiest thing was to look away, to draw the curtains, to find some business inside that needed tending. Maren had seen all of that before in 3 settlements now, and she could read the shape of a town's heart in the first hour she stood in it. She read this one quick enough. There was the general store with its sun-bleached porch, the church with its modest steeple, the cluster of cabins set back from the track like wary animals. Curtains twitched. A man with a hammer stopped his hammering. 2 women, by the well, bent their heads together and did not look up. And through all of it, Maren stood her ground. She did not weep. She did not beg. That was the thing about her, the thing that struck anyone who looked close enough to see past the dust. There was no break in her. The word abandoned lived in her eyes, sure enough, but it lived there the way an old scar lives on a working hand, a thing that happened, a thing survived, not a thing that had ruined her. Her jaw was set with a quiet dignity that you do not learn from comfort. You earn it, mile by mile, on roads where nobody is coming to help you. She had buried a husband she'd loved and then been failed by a second man she had not. A man who had ridden off one gray morning with the horses and the money and left her with a note that said less than nothing. She had walked away from that ruin with her chin up, and she had been walking ever since, looking for a single place on this wide, hard earth where a body might be allowed to simply stand without having to explain herself first. The dust settled and lifted around her boots in little curls. Somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet. Sat. The sun was sliding toward the western hills, throwing everything into that long amber light that the prairie saves for the end of the day, the light that makes even a hard place look like it might have a little tenderness left in it somewhere. Maren breathed it in. She did not yet know that she was being watched, or that the watching would change the whole course of what was left of her life. She only knew that she was tired clear down to the marrow, and that she had run out of road, and that this town, like all the others, had already decided what she was before she had spoken a single word. She lifted her chin a notch higher and waited to be turned away, the way she always was, the way she had learned to expect. But this time, somebody was watching who had no intention. Up on the porch of a cabin, set a ways back from the track, an old man stood leaning against the post, and he had been watching her since the moment she first appeared at the edge of his world. His name was Calhoun, and folks in that settlement knew him the way you know a fence line, always there, weathered, dependable, and not much given to talk. He was past 60, with a face like a creek bed in a dry spell, all lines and channels carved deep by sun and grief, and a white mustache he kept trimmed, even though there was no one left to trim it for. His arms were folded across his chest, and across his vest hung a silver watch chain that caught the late sun and threw it back in little flashes, the one fine thing he owned, given to him by a wife who had been 10 years in the ground now. Beside him on a nail hung a battered tin lantern, unlit, waiting for dark. Calhoun did not move. He had a stillness about him that some mistook for coldness, but it was nothing of the kind. It was the stillness of a man who had learned to wait, who had buried more than his share, who had watched the seasons turn over this same patch of ground, until he had stopped expecting anything from them except the next one. He had lost his Sarah to a fever one bitter February, and he had lost a son before that to a horse and a bad fall. And after that he had stopped going to the socials and stopped much caring what the town thought of one quiet widower who kept to himself and tended his garden and his small herd and asked nothing of anyone. But he was not a hard man. There was a difference, and anyone who had ever needed a hand from Calhoun knew it. He had pulled wagons out of the mud at midnight for folks who never thanked him. He had sat up with sick children that weren't his and read scripture in a low, rumbling voice to the dying, who had no one else. He simply did these things and went home and said nothing about them, and so the town had decided he was a strange old recluse, when the truth was, he had more decency in one knuckle than most of them had in their whole church-going bodies. Now he watched the woman standing in the dust, and something old and long quiet stirred in him. He saw the way she held herself. He saw the satchel clutched in both hands. He saw, most of all, the way nobody went to her, the way the whole settlement seemed to turn its shoulder all at once. A slow, collective shrug of judgment that he had seen the town perform before and had no use for. He knew what they were saying without hearing a word of it. Abandoned woman. No husband, no people. Trouble, most likely, or worse. He'd heard the whispers about other women, and he had watched those women move on down the road carrying a shame that did not belong to them, put on their backs by folks too comfortable to imagine how thin the line was between their own warm hearts and the cold open road. Calhoun's jaw worked once beneath the white mustache. His eyes, pale and steady under the brim of his hat, did not leave her. He was thinking of his Sarah and of a winter long ago, when she had been young and alone and a stranger had shown her a kindness that she never forgot that she spoke of, to the end of her days. He was thinking that a man comes to a certain point in his life when he understands that the only thing he truly owns is what he chooses to do, and that all the rest, the herd, the cabin, the watch chain, the good opinion of his neighbors, is just weather, here today, and gone with the season. He unfolded his arms slow. Inside the cabin, behind him, the day's last light came slanting through the open door and lay across the room like a hand laid gentle on a tired shoulder. It was a plain room, and an honest one. The kind a man builds when he has more time than money, and more sorrow than either. The walls were rough-hewn logs chinked with clay, hung here and there with the small, ordinary tools of a life lived close to the land. A coil of rope, a harness gone supple with oil, a tin cup hanging from a peg. In the center of it all stood the table, and the table was the heart of that house, the way a hearth is in some homes. Calhoun had made it himself the first winter, hewn the planks with his own hands and pegged them tight, and it had borne the weight of suppers and elbows and grief and a few hard-won laughs across more years than he liked to count. On the table now sat a loaf of cornbread, still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth, the color of cream. He baked it himself most evenings, the way Sarah had taught him, and ate it alone, and never quite got the measure of the salt right, but ate it anyway. And there beside it sat the tin lantern, the twin of the one hanging out on the porch, waiting unlit for the dark to come. But it was the chair that drew the eye. At the near end of the table, where the golden light pooled deepest, sat a single ladder-back chair, empty. Just an empty chair, you'd say, if you didn't know. But Calhoun knew. That chair had been Sarah's. He had sat across from it for 10 years now, every supper of every day, looking at the place where she used to be, and he had never once moved it or put it against the wall or used it for anything else. Some men might call that a sickness, a way of refusing to let the dead go. Calhoun never thought of it that way. He thought of it as keeping faith. He thought that as long as the chair waited, some part of the world still made a place for the people who were gone, and that mattered to him in a way he could not have put into words if you'd held a gun on him. The worn seat of that chair held the faint ghost of where a body used to settle. The light pooled in the hollow of it. And there it sat in that quiet room, holding its silent invitation out to no one, the way it had for 10 long, lonesome years. It was a curious thing, but in that moment, with the woman standing out there in the dust, and the town turning its back on her, the empty chair seemed less like a monument to the dead and more like a question that had finally found its answer. Calhoun had kept that place open without knowing why, without ever expecting it to be filled. He had told himself it was for Sarah, and maybe it had been for a while. But a chair is meant for sitting, and a table is meant for company, and a house with one living soul in it is not a home, so much as a held breath. The cornbread cooled on the cloth. The light deepened from gold to honey to the deep amber of the day's last hour. The lantern waited, and the chair waited too, patient and empty, in the warm hush of that lonely room, while out beyond the open door, a decision was being made that would, before the sun was fully down, change everything that little chair had ever meant. Calhoun came down off his porch, the way a man steps into cold water when he has already made up his mind to swim. No flinch, no hesitation, just one boot. He did not look back at the open door behind him, though the warm, dark mouth of his cabin framed him as he went, the lamplight not yet lit, but the day's gold spilling out around his shoulders. His chin was raised just a notch, not in pride exactly, but in the manner of a man squaring up to a thing he knows will cost him. And it would cost him. He understood that plain. He was not a foolish man, nor a young one full of grand ideas about how the world ought to be. He had lived long enough to know exactly how the settlement worked, how the talk would start at the well and travel to the store, and from the store to the pews. Come Sunday, how the same women who had brought him pies after Sarah passed would now press their lips thin and find reasons their children couldn't visit the strange old man who took in a fallen woman. He knew the preacher would have a word with him, gentle and disappointed, and he knew some of the men who had shaken his hand at the cattle sales would find their hands suddenly busy when he came near. He knew all of it, weighed all of it, in the few steps it took him to cross his own yard, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not care. That was the strange grace of growing old, he thought, the one mercy the years gave you in exchange for everything they took. They took your wife and your son, and the strength in your shoulders, and the spring in your knees, but in return they gave you this, a clear, cold view of what actually mattered. And what mattered was not what the women at the well thought. What mattered was a tired woman standing in the dust with nowhere to go, and a warm room behind him with bread on the table and an empty chair, and the simple, undeniable fact that he had the power to bridge that distance, and so it followed, plain as scripture, that he ought to. There was no great heroism in it, as far as he could see. There was only what was right and what was easy, and the easy thing was to stay on his porch and let her move on the way the town clearly wished, and the right thing was harder, and a man's whole life amounted to little more than the running tally of which one he chose. He thought of Sarah again as he walked, and what she would have done. She'd have been off that porch before he was likely, scolding him for being slow. She'd had no patience for the cruelty folks dressed up as propriety. She used to say that the meanest thing one human could do to another was to make them feel like they weren't fit to be looked at, and that any town that did such a thing had forgotten the better part of why people gathered together in the first place. Calhoun carried her voice with him as he crossed that yard, the way he carried everything she'd ever said, folded up small and kept close. His boots stirred the dust. The sun lay heavy and orange on the western hills now, and the long shadows of the cabins reached out across the track toward the woman like dark fingers, but Calhoun walked through them without slowing. He could see her clearer, now the lines of weariness in her face, the dignity holding it all together, the way her eyes tracked him with a wariness she could not quite hide, the wariness of someone who had been approached by men before and had learned what it usually meant. He saw that wariness, and he gentled his pace, and he kept his hands where she could see them, open and easy, and he came on steady toward her with the whole disapproving town watching from behind its curtains. He stopped a respectful few feet from her, close enough to speak low but not so close as to crowd, and for a moment the two of them just stood there in the amber light with the dust drifting between them like something out of an old painting. Up close, she was younger than he'd reckoned from the porch, though hardship had aged her around the eyes, and those eyes, gray-green, he saw now, like sage after rain, came up to meet his with a guarded steadiness that nearly made him forget what he'd come to say. He took off his hat. That was the first thing he did, and it was not a small thing, for a man does not bare his head to a woman. The town has decided is beneath them. He held the hat against his chest, and he looked at her straight, the way you'd look at any decent soul you meant to do right by, and he said his piece plain. "I've got an empty chair," he told her. The words came out rougher than he'd intended, gravel-worn from a voice that didn't get much use these days. But they came out true. "I've got an empty chair, ma'am, and a loaf of cornbread on the table that I'll only let go stale by myself, and a roof that doesn't leak in more than the one corner." He paused. There was no easy way to say the rest of it without saying too much, so he just said it. "I don't know your troubles, and I won't ask after them. But I know what it is to have a town look at you like you're nothing, and I know it's a lie, and I'll not stand on my porch and watch them do it to you. You're welcome at my table for as long as you've a mind to sit at it, that's all. That's the whole of it." And then he stopped talking, because he'd never been one for speeches, and he'd already given the longest one of his life. And he stood there with his hat against his chest, waiting to see what she would make of him. He watched the words land. He watched them travel across the distance between them and strike her somewhere she hadn't let anything strike in a long while. And he saw the first crack appear in that hard-won composure of hers, just the slightest parting of her lips, flicker of something behind the gray-green that might have been disbelief, or might have been the dangerous beginning of hope. She had been braced, he understood, for the usual thing. braced for a leer, for an offer with a price tag hung quiet on the end of it, for kindness that turned out to be a trap. She had heard 1,000 men say 1,000 soft things, and she had learned to hear the hook inside every one of them. But there was no hook in what this old man had said. She turned it over, looking for it, and could not find it. And that was what undid her composure, more than any cruelty ever could have, the plain, unaccountable fact of a decency that asked for nothing. Somewhere behind the curtains, Calhoun knew the whole town was watching this, was already drafting the story they'd tell about it, but he had stepped clean outside of all that, and there was only the woman in front of him and the truth. He did not press her. He did not fill the silence with more words, the way a lesser man might have, talking himself into and back out of his own kindness. He just stood, hat in hand, and let her decide. The way a person deserves to be, let decide a thing that big, in their own time, on their own terms, with their dignity left whole. For a long moment, Maren did not answer him at all, and Calhoun had the wisdom not to fill the silence. She stood there with the dry prairie wind lifting a loose strand of auburn hair across her brow, and behind her gray-green eyes a whole life was passing in review. She was thinking of all the doors that had closed in her face, of the long roads walked alone, of the particular cruelty of hope which had betrayed her more times than any man ever had. She had learned in the hard school of the frontier that hope was the most dangerous thing a body could carry, heavier than any satchel, because it could be set down and shattered in an instant and you'd cut your feet on the pieces for miles afterward. She had taught herself to expect nothing, and the teaching had kept her alive. And now here was this old man with his hat against his chest, threatening to unteach it all with a few rough sentences. She searched his face the way a woman searches a sky for the weather coming, looking for the lie, the angle, the trap she had learned always lay underneath, and she did not find it. That was the thing that loosened the breath in her chest. She had read 100 faces, and she could read his, and what was written there was nothing but a plain and weary kindness, the kind that has been through fire and come out the far side still intact. She saw the grief in him, recognized it the way one survivor recognizes another, and she understood somehow that his offer was not charity handed down from above, but something closer to fellowship, offered across one ruined soul to another. Here, sit. You're tired, I know. Her hand tightened once on the satchel strap, hard, the knuckles going pale, as some last frightened part of her urged her to refuse, to keep walking, to stay safe in the cold, familiar country of expecting nothing. To accept was to want something again, to let the door of her heart swing open even a crack, and she knew from bitter experience what came through doors left open. She nearly said no. The word was right there on her tongue. The polite, hard no she had said 100 times. Thank you kindly, sir, but I'll be moving on. But then the wind shifted, and she caught the smell of the cornbread drifting from the open cabin door behind him, warm and homely, and aching with everything she'd lost, and something in her simply gave way. Not broke, gave way. The way a dam doesn't break, but rather decides all at once to let the water through. She exhaled, slow, a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 years and 400 miles. Her shoulders, which had been carried high and tight for so long that the muscles had forgotten any other way to be, came down a fraction. The strand of auburn hair settled back against her cheek, as the wind eased. And her hand, gripping that satchel strap white-knuckled, relaxed, uncurled, finger by finger, until it merely held the strap the way a hand holds a thing it no longer needs to defend. In that small motion was the whole of her surrender, and her courage too, for it takes more courage to accept kindness than to refuse it, more courage to hope than to despair. She was not a woman to be saved, and she'd have spat at anyone who said she was. But she was a woman tired, clear to the bone, and here was a chair and a roof and a man who had stood up in front of his whole town and said she was not nothing. She lifted her eyes from the dust where they'd dropped and brought them back to his, and the wariness in them had not vanished entirely. It would not for a long while yet, but it had moved aside enough to let something else through. Something quiet and resolving, like a decision made not in a flash, but in the slow settling of all the weight she carried, finally finding a place to rest. Calhoun saw the answer in her before she gave it, the way you see rain coming on the wind before the first drop falls. And something in his old chest eased that had been clenched tight for longer than he cared to admit. But he was not done yet. There was one more thing to say, and he meant to say it plain, because he wanted no misunderstanding hanging over the threshold of his home, no shadow of obligation or shame for her to carry inside with her satchel. He had told her about the chair and the bread and the roof. Now he told her the rest, and as he said it, the hard golden light of the dying day caught the side of his weathered face and lit up the white of his mustache and threw the rest into shadow, so that his profile against the sky looked like something carved, a thing of stone and resolve. "They'll talk," he said, and his jaw set firm beneath the mustache as the words came. He turned his face just slightly, looking out past her, now toward the settlement, toward the twitching curtains and the bent heads at the well, and the man who'd stopped his hammering, taking in the whole watching town in a single unhurried glance. "They'll talk, and they'll say their pieces, and they'll have themselves a fine time of it for a week or two." He let that sit a moment, and then he brought his eyes back to hers, and he finished it. "I don't care what they say." The words were quiet. That was the strange power of them. He did not raise his voice, did not square his shoulders, or puff up his chest, the way a younger man might have, performing his defiance for the benefit of the watchers. He said it the way he'd have told you the price of grain, or the look of the weather, a plain statement of plain fact, and that was what gave it its terrible weight. A loud man's defiance you can dismiss. He's working himself up to it, you think, talking himself into a bravery he doesn't quite own. But a quiet man who says, "I don't care what they say," in the same tone he'd use to mention it might rain, that's a man who has already settled the matter somewhere, deep inside himself, long before the words ever reached his lips. Maren heard it. She heard the difference. She had been around men who talked big and folded small. And she had been around the rarer kind whose softness was the iron underneath, and she knew at once which kind stood before her now. The settlement could bring all its weight to bear, and this old man would simply stand there in the path of it like a fence post in a flood, unmoved, because he had decided, and his deciding was a thing more solid than the opinions of 100 righteous neighbors. There was no anger in his face as he said it, and that was the wonder of it. A man might defy his town out of spite, out of stubbornness, out of some old grudge he was looking to settle, but there was none of that in Calhoun. There was only a great and weary certainty, the certainty of a man who has already made his peace with loneliness and judgment, and the slow turning away of his fellows, and who has discovered, on the far side of all that, a kind of freedom. when you have already lost the things that frighten other people into silence, when you have buried your love and your child and outlived the good opinion of your neighbors and survived all of it, then there is nothing left for the town to threaten you with. He had nothing left to lose that he was not willing to lose. And so he could stand there in the golden light with his line drawn in the dust and say, "I don't care what they say," and mean every grain of it down to the bottom of his weathered soul. She came on toward the cabin then, and Calhoun stepped aside to let her pass. And the moment Maren crossed into the doorway, the whole quality of the light changed around her. Out in the yard there had been the hard amber glare of the dying sun, all edges and long shadows, but here, at the threshold, the warm interior glow reached out and washed over her face, soft as a remembered touch, gilding the freckles scattered across her cheekbones, picking out the auburn in her wind-blown hair, smoothing for just a moment all the weariness the road had carved into her. She paused there on the sill, satchel still riding her shoulder, and she let her eyes travel the room, the rough log walls, the tools on their pegs, the loaf of cornbread on its cream-colored cloth. And then her gaze dropped, almost against her will, to the ladder-back chair, waiting empty at the near end of the table, with the last of the gold pooling in its worn seat. She looked at that chair a long moment, and Calhoun, watching from just behind her, understood that she knew. Somehow, she knew what that chair was, whose it had been, what it had meant in the long, lonely years of his keeping faith with it. Maybe it was the way the room had grown up around it, every other thing worn and used, and the chair worn too, but worn in a way that spoke of waiting rather than using. Maybe it was just that grief recognizes grief, the way it had passed between them, out in the dust. Whatever it was, she understood that she was not being offered a spare seat, a thing of no account. She was being offered a place that had been held sacred, held empty against all reason for 10 long years, and that the old man was choosing in this moment with his whole town watching, to open it at last, and to open it to her. The weight of that nearly undid her composure a second time. She felt her throat tighten and her eyes sting, and she had to look away from the chair and breathe before she trusted herself to move again. Because she had expected, at most, to be tolerated, to be allowed to sit in a corner and be grateful and small and quiet, to take the kindness as a beggar takes a coin, with her head bowed and her worth diminished by the taking. That was how charity usually went in her experience. It fed you and humiliated you in the same motion, made sure you understood the great gulf between the giver and the gotten. But this was something else entirely. This was a man clearing the best place at his table, the place his dead wife had held, and offering it to a stranger the world had thrown away, as if to say, "You are not less than the people I have loved. You are not beneath this house. Come and sit where my heart's treasure used to sit and be welcome." Maren raised her eyes from the chair and lifted her chin, and the resolve in her face, set fully now, hardened into something she would carry for the rest of her days. She would not bow her head. She understood, suddenly and completely, that this man did not want her to. He had not offered her pity. He had offered her dignity back, the very thing the town had tried to strip from her in the dust. And the only way to honor an offer like that was to take it standing tall. So she stepped fully through the doorway, into the warm, amber light, into the small, good world that smelled of cornbread and clay and oiled leather, and she did not creep, and she did not cower. She walked in like a person with every right to be there, because that, she finally let herself believe, was exactly what she was. She set her satchel down beside the table at last. Set it down, after all those miles, after all those nights, of keeping it close as a sleeping child, for fear someone might take the little she had left, and she pulled out the ladder-back chair, and she sat. And the moment she did, the chair was no longer empty, and something in the whole house seemed to exhale. Calhoun had crossed to the table while she settled, and now he struck a match and touched it to the wick of the tin lantern, and the small flame caught and steadied, and threw its circle of gold across the worn planks, across the cornbread loaf. The room came alive, in that light, the way a room does when there are two souls in it instead of one. Maren sat straight, her hands resting easy on the rough wood beside the bread. And there was a remarkable quality to the way she sat, neither grateful nor ashamed, neither the cringing recipient of charity. She was simply present, simply there, in the chair, at the table, in the light, the way a person ought to be allowed to simply be somewhere without owing the world an apology for it. She did not gush her thanks, and Calhoun did not want her thanks. And so the two of them sat for a while in a silence that was not awkward but full, the comfortable silence of people who have already said the only things that needed saying. Outside the light was going, the gold giving way to the blue, and then the deep violet of the prairie evening. But inside the lantern held its small, bright circle, steady against the dark, and within that circle there was warmth and bread, and the unlikely beginning of something neither of them had dared to expect from the day when it dawned. Maren let her gaze move once more around the room, slower now, taking its measure, not as a stranger sizing up a danger, but as a person beginning, carefully, tentatively, to imagine a place in it. There were the pegs where a second cloak might hang. There, on a shelf she had not noticed before, was a daguerreotype. In a tin frame, a woman's face, and Maren understood, without asking, that this was the one whose chair she sat in, and she felt no jealousy and no shame, only a quiet kinship, as if she had been welcomed not just by the old man. Two women, across the divide of death making room for one another in the heart of a lonely house. The cornbread waited between them, and presently Calhoun unwrapped it and broke it, and pushed half across the planks to her, and she took it, and they ate together in the lantern light, and it was the finest meal she had eaten in 3 years, though it was only cornbread, and a little salt got wrong. She sat straight the whole while. She would not slump into gratitude, and she would not perform humility. She had been given back the right to take up space in the world, and she meant to honor it by taking it up fully, by being a whole person at that table and not a grateful shadow. Calhoun watched her eat and felt the old clenched thing in his chest unclench another notch, and he thought, with something that was almost a smile beneath the white mustache, that the chair had been waiting all along, not for the dead to come back, but for the living to come at last through the door. Sarah would have liked her, he thought. Sarah would have set another loaf to bake, and pulled her own chair up close and talked the night through. And maybe, in the warm lantern light, with the prairie dark pressing soft against the windows, Sarah was not so very far away after all. When the meal was done, and the dishes set aside, Calhoun rose and went to the door, and he stood there a long while, looking out at the world he had just defied. The settlement lay quiet under the early stars, the dusty track running pale through the gathering dark, the cabin shut up tight, the windows here and there glowing with the warm, dishonest light of homes where folks sat in judgment of him. He could near about hear the talk already, riding the night air from porch to porch. The old fool's taken her in. Did you see it? Right in front of God and everybody. He stood and let the talk wash over him in his mind, and he found, as he'd known he would, that it did not touch him. He had drawn his line in the dust that afternoon, and he had stepped across it, and a man who has crossed his own line and found the ground holding firm beneath him is a hard man to shame afterward. Behind him, the lantern glowed warm and steady, and he could feel the changed weight of the house at his back. The simple, miraculous fact of another breathing person within those walls. The small sounds of her settling, the way a home sounds when it is finally being a home again. He had forgotten that sound. Twant. 10 years he'd lived in the silence and told himself it suited him. And it had taken a stranger in the dust to remind him that a man is not meant to eat his bread alone in an empty room, keeping a chair warm for ghosts. His face in the doorway was resolved and unbothered, the face of a man entirely at peace with the cost of what he'd done. Let them talk. Talk was wind, and he had stood against a lifetime of prairie wind, and was standing yet. What he had done was right, and the rightness of it was a warmth in him that no amount of cold neighborly judgment could put out. He thought of the years ahead, the way the town would test them, the slights and the snubs and the long campaign of small cruelties that the righteous wage against those who shame them with simple decency. He'd weather it. They both would. He had taken her measure, same as she'd taken his. And he knew she was not a woman who broke, and he was not a man who bent. And together, in that small, warm cabin, they would be a fortress that all the gossip of the settlement could not breach. In time, perhaps, the town would come around, the way towns sometimes do, shamed slowly into their better selves by the steady, undeniable example of two people simply living decent lives in defiance of the cruelty all around them. Or perhaps they never would, and it would not matter, because the warmth was inside the cabin and the cold was out there in the dark where it belonged. Calhoun looked out a moment longer at the dusty trail, the road she had walked in on, the road that had brought her out of all that hardship to his door, and he gave a slow nod to the night, to the providence or the chance or whatever it was that had set her boots on his particular stretch of the world. Then he turned and went back into the lantern light, to the woman at the table, and the half-eaten bread, and the chair that would never be empty again. But he left the door open. That was the thing of it, friend. The thing I want you to carry away from this old tale. He did not shut the door against the watching world and barricade himself inside with his defiance. He left it standing open to the night, the warm gold light spilling out across his porch and down into the dust for anyone to see, unashamed, unhidden, a small steady beacon in a hard dark country. Because a man who has done right has no need to bar his door, and a kindness done in the open is a kindness that cannot be made shameful by any whispering tongue. The lantern burned, the chair was filled, and the door stayed open to the long, dark trail, the way a door ought to, for the next tired soul who might come walking out of the dust with nowhere left to go.